The musket fire had stopped, but the screaming had not. Henry Calloway lay against a broken cartwheel, his hand pressed hard against his side, blood soaking through his fingers faster than he could stop it. Julian Ashworth knelt beside him, tearing strips from his own coat, pressing them uselessly against the wound. "Do not do this," Julian said. "Do not you dare leave me here." Henry's laugh was weak and wet. "You always were terrible at giving orders," he said. "Listen to me. Listen, because I will not say this twice." Julian leaned closer. Smoke drifted across the field behind them, and somewhere far off a horse was screaming. "My sister," Henry said. "Eleanor. She has no one. Our father is gone, our mother is gone, and our cousin Edgar will pick her bones clean the moment he learns I am dead. Promise me, Julian. Promise me you will not let that happen." "I promise," Julian said, and he meant it with everything he had left in him. Henry's grip loosened. His eyes stayed open a moment longer, fixed on nothing, and then he was gone. Julian stayed there in the mud until the surgeons came to pull him away. 4 months later, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rowan, stood in front of a narrow townhouse in a quiet, fading street in London, reading a brass plate that had not been polished in some time. He had put off this visit longer than he should have. Guilt did that to a man. It made him slow when he should have been fast. He knocked. A maid answered, thin and nervous, and led him into a parlor with faded curtains and furniture that had clearly been sold piece by piece, leaving gaps like missing teeth. Eleanor Calloway came down a moment later, and Julian was struck first by how much she looked like her brother, the same steady gray eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw. She was thinner than he remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was careful, guarded. "I did not expect you." "I should have come sooner," Julian said. "I am sorry for that. And I am sorrier still for your loss. Henry was the best man I ever knew." Something moved behind her eyes, quick and painful, and then it was gone, folded away. "Thank you," she said. "Please, sit." He did not sit. Instead he came straight to the point, because he did not trust himself to soften it. "Your cousin, Edgar, what has he told you?" Her jaw tightened further. "That the house is entailed away from me, that my brother's debts are mine to answer for, that he has found me a husband, a Mr. Pratley, twice my age and 3 times my temper, who is willing to take on both the debts and me, provided I sign the last of my inheritance over to Edgar first." She said all of this flatly, as though reciting a list of household expenses. "I have a fortnight to agree, or he says the bailiffs will come for the furniture that is left." Julian felt something cold settle in his chest. "And do you intend to agree?" "I intend," she said, "to survive. Beyond that I have not had the luxury of intending anything." He studied her for a long moment. The room was cold, he noticed. There was no fire lit, though it was only October and the evenings had turned sharp. "Marry me instead," he said. She stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "I beg your pardon." "Marry me," he said again. "It solves everything Edgar dangles over you. My name protects you from him entirely. You will never answer for Henry's debts, because I will settle them myself. Today, before I leave this room, you will have a home, a household, a place in the world that no one can take from you." Eleanor's hands had gone very still in her lap. "Why," she said slowly, "would you do such a thing?" "Because I promised your brother I would look after you," Julian said. "Because he died believing I would keep that promise, and I intend to keep it, whatever it costs me." Something in her face closed like a door. "So this is charity," she said, "so dressed up as a proposal." "It is a debt," Julian said. "I owe your brother my life twice over, and I cannot repay him now except through you. Call it what you like. I call it honor." Eleanor stood and walked to the cold hearth, wrapping her arms around herself. "I do not want to be anyone's debt repaid," she said quietly. "I do not want to spend my life being grateful to a man who married me out of guilt." "Then do not be grateful," Julian said. "Be practical. You said yourself you have a fortnight before Edgar forces your hand. I am offering you a way out that does not involve Mr. Pratley, or signing away everything your brother left you. You need not love me, Eleanor. You need not even like me. I am only asking you to let me keep my word." She turned back to him, and for the first time he saw not just grief in her face but something sharper, something that had been buried under it. Anger, perhaps, or pride, badly wounded and trying to stand up straight again. "I will think on it," she said. "That is all I ask," Julian said, and he took his leave before either of them could say anything further. He did not have to wait a fortnight. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Rowan House, written in a careful, controlled hand that gave away nothing of what it had cost her to write it. "Edgar came to the house this morning," the letter read. He brought Mr. Prattley with him, and papers already drawn up for my signature. I told them both that I am to be married to the Duke of Rowan within the month, and that any claim on my brother's estate should be directed to your solicitor from this point forward. I hope, Your Grace, that I have not spoken out of turn." Julian read it twice, and felt, beneath the satisfaction of having kept Edgar at bay, a small strange flicker of something he did not examine too closely. He wrote back a single line: "You have not spoken out of turn. You have only spoken the truth a little ahead of time. I will call on you tomorrow to discuss the arrangements." The wedding itself, when it came, was a quiet affair, held early in the morning in a small chapel with only a handful of witnesses. Eleanor wore gray, not white, and Julian did not ask why. He suspected he already knew. White was for brides who were beginning something joyful. Gray suited a bargain struck in grief. She did not cry during the ceremony. She did not smile either. She simply stood beside him, her chin lifted, her voice steady when she made her vows, and Julian found himself watching her more closely than he meant to, trying to read what lay beneath that composure. Afterward, in the carriage that would carry them out of London and toward Rowan Hall, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the passing streets. "You need not perform happiness for my benefit," Julian said finally, when the silence had stretched too long. "I know what this is." "Do you?" she said, not quite a question. "A bargain," he said. "An honorable one, I hope, but a bargain all the same." She turned her head to look at him then, and something in her expression was harder to name than grief or anger. "Then we understand each other, Your Grace," she said, and turned back to the window. Before they had gone another mile, Eleanor spoke again, her voice quieter this time, less guarded than before. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" "You may ask me anything," Julian said, "though I make no promise of a satisfying answer." "Why did Henry never write to me about you as a friend he trusted with something so large?" she asked. "He wrote of you often, in his letters home. Julian did this, Julian said that. I knew your name before I ever knew your face. But he never once mentioned what kind of man you were beneath the uniform. I find myself married to someone I have heard described 100 times, and yet I do not know him at all." Julian considered the question longer than she expected. "Henry was careful that way," he said finally. "He kept the different parts of his life separate, I think, on purpose. His sister in one drawer, his brothers in arms in another. Perhaps he thought if he mixed them too freely, he would lose something of each. I only know that he spoke of you the same way, sparingly, and always with more warmth than he showed for almost anything else. He was proud of you, prouder than I think you ever knew." Eleanor's eyes glistened, though she blinked the feeling back before it could fall. "He never said so, in his letters to me." "Some men cannot say the thing directly," Julian said. "They can only act on it. He gave his life proving it, in the end." They rode in silence again after that, though it was a different silence than before, less brittle, touched faintly with something like the beginning of trust. Eleanor watched the hedgerows blur past the window and allowed herself, just once, to imagine what her brother would have thought of the man sitting across from her, and found, to her own surprise, that she already suspected the answer. By the time the carriage turned up the long drive toward Rowan Hall, the sky had begun to darken toward evening, and the great house rose ahead of them, its windows lit one by one as servants moved through the rooms preparing for their arrival. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten at the sight of it, so much larger and grander than anything she had known, and she was grateful, in that moment, that Julian did not attempt to fill the silence with false reassurance. He simply reached over and, briefly, steadied her hand where it rested on the seat between them, before withdrawing it again just as quickly, as though he too was not yet certain what he was permitted to offer. Julian watched the fields go by and told himself that understanding was enough. It would have to be. He had made his promise to a dying man on a battlefield, not to himself, and certainly not to his own heart. Whatever softness might grow between himself and Eleanor Calloway, now Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Rowan, was a complication he had not planned for, and did not intend to allow. He did not yet know how little say he would have in the matter. The carriage rolled on through the autumn light, carrying them both toward a house full of ghosts, disapproving portraits, and a future neither of them had chosen, but both of them would soon come to need. The portrait caught Eleanor's eye the moment she stepped into the great hall of Rowan House, and it did not let go. A woman in dark blue silk, painted with a stare so sharp it seemed to follow every movement in the room. Julian's mother, the housekeeper told her later, dead some 10 years now, but still ruling the house from her gilded frame. Her grace was very particular about how things were done. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, said, in a tone that made clear she expected the new Duchess to be particular in exactly the same way. Eleanor did not answer. She had learned, in the space of a single carriage ride and one long, silent dinner the night before, that answering too quickly in this house tended to invite scrutiny she did not yet know how to manage. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Julian rose early and disappeared into his study or out onto the estate, returning only for meals, where he spoke to her with a courtesy so perfect it felt like a wall. He asked after her comfort. He asked if the rooms suited her. He never asked what she thought or felt or wanted, and she began to understand that this was deliberate. He had built the marriage as a debt discharged, and he seemed determined that it stay exactly that, tidy and closed. Nothing owed on either side beyond what had already been paid. Eleanor told herself this suited her perfectly well. She had not married for warmth. She had married for survival, and survival she had. And yet, in the long, empty hours between breakfast and dinner, in a house where every servant watched her out of the corner of their eye to see how the new Duchess would behave, she found the coldness harder to bear than she had expected. So she did what she had always done when grief or fear threatened to swallow her whole. She found work. She began with the household ledgers, which she discovered, quite by accident, sitting untouched in a drawer of the morning room desk. Mrs. Whitfield managed the day-to-day accounts, but no one, it seemed, had looked closely at the larger patterns in years. Eleanor spent 3 days going through them, and found that the estate was losing money on its home farm at a rate that would have alarmed her father, had he still been alive to see it. She brought her findings to the estate steward, a weathered man named Colonel Grant who had served the family for decades and clearly did not expect to be questioned by the new Duchess about crop rotation. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said, not unkindly, "but the home farm has always been managed this way." "Then it has always been losing money," Eleanor said, and laid the ledger open in front of him. "Look here. 3 fields left fallow that need not be, and a tenant paying for equipment the estate could supply at half the cost if we bought in bulk with the other farms. I am not accusing you of poor management, Colonel. I am asking why no one has looked at these numbers in 5 years." Colonel Grant studied the ledger for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted from wariness to something closer to respect. "No one has asked me to explain myself in some time," he admitted. "I confess I find it refreshing." Word of the exchange spread through the house faster than Eleanor expected. By the end of the week, the cook was asking her opinion on the winter stores, and a young housemaid named Sophie had taken to lingering near whatever room Eleanor occupied, eager for any small task that might earn a kind word. Julian noticed the change before he understood it. He noticed it first in small things, the steward's ledgers arriving on his desk with neat marginal notes he had not made himself, the servants moving through the house with a new brisk purpose, as though someone had finally given them permission to care about their work again. He noticed it, too, in Eleanor herself, the way her shoulders had begun to lose some of their guarded stiffness when she thought no one was watching. He found her one evening in the estate office, long after he had assumed the house had gone quiet, bent over a stack of papers with a single candle burning low beside her. "You are still awake," he said, more surprised than he meant to sound. She looked up, and for a moment, before she remembered to arrange her expression into something more careful, he saw simple, unguarded satisfaction on her face. "I found a way to save the estate nearly £400 a year on the home farm alone," she said. "I wanted to have the figures ready before Colonel Grant's next report." Julian crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the columns of neat, careful writing. £400, he repeated. "At least," she said. "Possibly more, once the new arrangement with the tenant farmers takes hold." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way he had been careful not to since the wedding. "You did not have to do any of this," he said. "I did not ask it of you." "No," she agreed. "You did not ask anything of me at all." She said it lightly, but there was an edge beneath it that he could not quite miss. He was still turning that edge over in his mind 2 days later, when Julian's aunt, Lady Vane, arrived at Rowan Hall entirely unannounced, trailing behind her a small procession of trunks and opinions. "I simply had to see for myself," Lady Vane declared over dinner that evening, addressing the table at large but her eyes fixed pointedly on Eleanor. "A hasty marriage, so soon after mourning, to the sister of your late friend. People will talk, Julian. They already are." "Let them talk," Julian said evenly. "Eleanor is my wife. That is the whole of the matter." Lady Vane's gaze sharpened, turning fully on Eleanor now. "And what do you make of your husband's sudden gallantry, my dear? Some might call it noble, others might call it convenient, given how neatly it settled your family's debts." Eleanor felt heat rise in her face, but she kept her voice steady. "I call it a kindness I did not ask for and cannot fully repay," she said. and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain my husband never regrets extending it." The words hung in the air a moment too long. Julian looked at her, startled, and something passed between them across the table, quick and unguarded, before Lady Vane sniffed and turned the conversation toward safer matters: the state of the roads, the price of coal, the tedious business of the season in town. Later that night, when the house had finally quieted and the guest wing had gone dark, Julian found himself standing outside Eleanor's door longer than he meant to, his hand raised to knock, before he thought better of it and let it fall. He knocked instead the next morning and found her already awake, seated by the window with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the mist lift off the eastern fields. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for last night. My aunt has a talent for making people feel small. You did not let her." Eleanor's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I have had practice," she said. "My cousin Edgar has the same talent, only sharper. I learned long ago that the only defense is refusing to look smaller than you feel." Julian sat, uninvited, in the chair across from her, and for once did not seem in a hurry to leave. "Henry used to say something similar," he said, "that the trick to surviving anything was refusing to shrink for the comfort of the people trying to make you." Eleanor's eyes softened at her brother's name, though the old grief still moved behind them, quick and familiar. "He used to say that to me when we were children," she said quietly. "I had forgotten he ever said it to anyone else." "He said a great many things to me, over the years," Julian said. "I think, if he could see us now, he would tell me I have been managing this marriage exactly as badly as I manage everything else I care about too much to think about clearly." It was the closest either of them had come to admitting that this careful, formal arrangement had become something neither of them fully understood, and both of them seemed to feel the weight of it at once. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Julian looked out the window. "We should not keep speaking of him as though he is only just gone," Eleanor said finally. "It has been nearly a year." "Grief does not follow a calendar," Julian said. "If it did, I imagine a great many of us would manage it far better than we do." Eleanor looked up at him then, and for the first time since the wedding, there was no wall between them, only two people who had both lost the same man in different ways, sitting quietly together in the early morning light. "Colonel Grant tells me you have doubled the efficiency of the home farm in under a fortnight," Julian said, breaking the silence before it could grow too heavy. "He seems half convinced you should be running the whole estate." "Only half convinced," Eleanor said, some of her old composure returning, with a hint of dry humor beneath it. "I shall have to work harder." Julian laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him before he could stop it, and Eleanor found herself smiling in return, an actual smile, unguarded and warm, the first she had given him since her arrival. Neither of them spoke of what that small, unguarded moment meant. Neither of them was quite ready to. But something had shifted in the room, quiet and undeniable, and long after Julian had gone, Eleanor sat by the window a while longer, watching the mist finally clear from the fields, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not entirely unhappy with the life she had been given. In the days that followed, the small warmth between them seemed to spread outward, touching even the corners of the house that had once felt coldest. Julian began joining her in the mornings, not out of obligation but because, he admitted once with something close to embarrassment, he had grown to prefer her company at breakfast to eating alone with only the newspaper for conversation. Eleanor found herself waiting for those mornings, for the easy back and forth of household matters that slowly gave way to lighter talk, about books they had both read, about childhood memories neither had shared with anyone in years. One afternoon, walking the eastern boundary of the estate together to inspect a stretch of fence Colonel Grant had flagged for repair, Julian told her, almost offhand, about the years before the war, when he and Henry had been young men together at university, reckless and certain of their own invincibility in the particular way only the very young ever are. "He once wagered an entire term's allowance that he could outride me across the North Meadow," Julian said, a rare smile softening his face. "He lost, spectacularly, and refused to pay for a week out of pure stubbornness, until I threatened to tell his father." Eleanor laughed, a full unguarded sound that surprised even her. "That sounds precisely like him," she said. "He hated losing more than he loved winning. I used to beat him at cards on purpose sometimes, just to watch him sulk about it for an hour before he forgave me." "I believe I would have liked knowing you both together," Julian said, more quietly now. "I only ever heard about you secondhand, through him. I find I regret that more than I expected to." Eleanor glanced sideways at him, something warm and unfamiliar stirring behind her ribs. "You know me now," she said simply. "I do," Julian agreed, and for a moment neither of them said anything further. content to walk on together in a silence that had, somewhere in the last few weeks, stopped being uncomfortable at all. It was not long after this that Lady Vane's visit arrived, uninvited and untimely as ever, but even her sharp remarks could not undo what had been quietly building between them. If anything, defending each other in front of a hostile audience seemed only to draw them closer. Two people learning, almost in spite of themselves, that they had become allies before they had ever fully admitted to becoming anything more. She did not yet know that her cousin Edgar had not accepted his defeat so easily, or that the peace settling over Rowan Hall was only the quiet before he made his next move. The drawer would not open, and that alone was enough to make Eleanor curious. She had gone into Julian's study to leave a report from Colonel Grant on his desk, expecting the room to be empty at that hour, but her hand had brushed the bottom drawer of the writing table and found it locked, the only locked drawer in a room otherwise open and orderly. Curiosity, an old and stubborn habit from childhood, got the better of her before she could stop herself. She found the small key resting beneath a paperweight shaped like a hunting dog, and told herself she would only look, only for a moment, only to satisfy the itch of not knowing. Inside were letters, a whole bundle of them, tied with plain string, and the handwriting on the topmost one stopped her breath in her chest. It was Henry's hand, familiar, slanted, careless with its loops, exactly as she remembered it from the letters he used to send her from school, years before either of them had any notion of war. She untied the string with fingers that were not quite steady. The letters spanned nearly 2 years, and as Eleanor read them, sitting on the floor of her husband's study with her skirts pooled around her, a different story began to take shape than the one she had been told. She had always believed Henry died in the ordinary chaos of battle, one soldier among many, struck down by the enemy in the confusion of the field, but the letters told something else. In the last of them, dated only weeks before his death, Henry had written about a night raid gone wrong, about Julian pressing forward into danger to reach a wounded man from another company, about how he, Henry, had pulled his friend back from a position that was about to be overrun, taking the wound meant for Julian in the process. "He does not know I saw it coming," Henry had written, in a letter clearly meant for someone else, someone he trusted with the full truth. He would never forgive himself if he knew. Let him believe what he needs to believe. It cost me nothing I would not have given freely. Eleanor sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and understood, all at once, precisely what Julian had been carrying since the day he first came to her door. She found him an hour later in the small library that overlooked the garden, and she did not soften her approach. "You told me Henry died in battle," she said, setting the letters on the table between them. "You did not tell me he died saving your life." Julian went very still. His eyes moved from her face to the letters and back again, and something in him seemed to fold inward, the composure he wore so carefully cracking at last. "Where did you find those?" he asked, though his voice held no real anger, only a kind of exhausted resignation. "In your desk," she said. "I should not have opened it. I am not sorry that I did." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letters as though they might burn him. "It happened exactly as Henry described," he said finally. "We were sent to pull a wounded man from a position that should never have been ours to hold that night. I went forward. I misjudged the ground, misjudged everything, and found myself cut off with the enemy closing in. Henry came after me. He should not have. It was not his place, not his risk to take. But he came, and he pulled me clear, and the shot that should have found me found him instead." Eleanor's throat had gone tight. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because it is unbearable," Julian said simply. "Because every day since, I have known that I am alive and breathing in this house, married to his sister, because Henry Calloway thought my life worth more than his own, and I have never once believed that to be true. I did not tell you because I did not know how to say it without you looking at me exactly the way you are looking at me now." "And how am I looking at you?" she asked quietly. "Like you pity me," he said, "or worse, like you blame me. Both would be fair." Eleanor crossed the room and sat down across from him, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "I do not pity you," she said. "And I do not blame you either. My brother made a choice. He was always the kind of man who made that choice, long before he ever met you. I have spent a year believing he died for nothing, in the confusion of a war he should never have had to fight. Now I know he died protecting someone he loved. That is not a burden you owe me an apology for, Julian. That is a gift, however painful, and I would rather have the truth than the comfortable lie." Julian looked at her as though she had said something entirely unexpected, and in a way she had. For the first time since their wedding, he was not looking at her as a debt to be honored, or a promise kept, but simply as herself, sitting close to him in the fading afternoon light, offering him something he had not realized he needed until she gave it. I promised him I would look after you, Julian said, his voice rough. I have spent every day since trying to do that properly, and every day failing to understand what properly even means. I built walls between us because I told myself that was what honoring his memory required, that I owed you protection and nothing more, that anything warmer would be a kind of theft from a man who can no longer object. And what do you think now? Eleanor asked. I think, Julian said slowly, as though testing each word before he trusted it, that Henry would be furious with me for treating you like a stranger in your own home for the better part of a year. Something in Eleanor's chest loosened, a knot she had not known she was carrying until it began to ease. He would, she agreed. He always did hate excessive formality. He used to say it was what people hid behind when they were afraid of something honest. They sat together as the light changed outside the windows, and for the first time since the wedding, the silence between them held no wall at all, only something new and unnamed, fragile as first frost. It did not last. 3 days later, a note arrived at Rowan Hall, delivered by a rider who did not wait for a reply. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately, sharp and slanting, and unmistakably her cousin's. My dear Eleanor, Edgar had written, I hope marriage suits you as well as your new fortune clearly does. I find myself in the district on business and thought it only proper to call. I have heard the most interesting stories making the rounds of the local assemblies, about a hasty wedding arranged rather too conveniently after your brother's death. People do love to speculate on what a duke might gain from marrying a penniless soldier's sister. I confess I am curious myself. Perhaps we might discuss it, cousin to cousin, before I decide whether the stories deserve to travel any further. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands cold despite the warmth of the morning room, and then carried it straight to Julian's study without knocking. He is here, she said, laying the letter on the desk in front of him, and he means to make trouble. Julian read it once, his jaw tightening with every line, and when he looked up, the softness of the last 3 days had hardened into something else entirely, sharp and protective, and entirely unwilling to be managed. Then let him try, Julian said. He will find I am not nearly so easy to threaten as a grieving girl alone in London with no one to stand beside her. He will find, in fact, that he has made a considerable mistake. He will come here himself, most likely, Julian went on, pacing now in front of the cold hearth, his earlier softness entirely replaced by a hard, focused anger she had not seen from him before. He is not a man who threatens quietly from a distance. He wants to see the effect of his words firsthand. We should be ready for him. What will you do? Eleanor asked. Nothing rash, Julian said, though the tightness in his jaw suggested restraint was costing him some effort. I will write to my solicitor tonight and have him confirm, in writing, that every debt of your brother's was settled in full at the time of our marriage, with documentation Edgar cannot dispute. I will also send word to Colonel Grant to keep watch on the roads leading to the house. If Edgar intends to call uninvited, I would prefer we are not taken by surprise. Eleanor watched him work, methodical even in his anger, and found herself grateful for it, for the steadiness he brought to a situation that might otherwise have left her paralyzed with old, familiar fear. Edgar had always been skilled at making her feel small and powerless, a habit formed in childhood when he was older and crueler and she had no one to intervene on her behalf. It was strange, she thought, watching Julian fold Henry's letters carefully back into their bundle and lock them once more in the drawer. How different it felt to face her cousin's threats with someone standing firmly beside her instead of alone. Edgar has always mistaken kindness for weakness, she said quietly. He believes that because I did not fight him outright as a girl, I will not fight him now. He does not understand what has changed. And what has changed? Julian asked, pausing to look at her. I am no longer alone, Eleanor said simply. Julian crossed the room and took her hand, the gesture unpracticed but entirely sincere. No, he agreed, you are not. And neither, Cousin Edgar will soon discover, am I. Eleanor felt, beneath the fear that had settled cold in her stomach, something that surprised her with its strength. Not just gratitude for his protection, though there was that too, but something warmer, something that had been growing quietly in her ever since the night in the estate office, and had bloomed fully in the hour they had just spent sharing Henry's memory between them. That evening, unable to settle into sleep, Eleanor made her way back down to the library, expecting to find it empty, and instead found Julian there again, this time with Henry's letters spread across the table in front of him, reading through them a second time with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something beyond what he had already found. I did not mean to disturb you, she said, pausing in the doorway. You are not disturbing me, he said, gesturing her toward the chair across from him. I find I cannot stop reading them. There is a version of Henry in these pages I never fully knew, even after years of serving beside him. He wrote to someone near the end, about fear, about how he was not always as brave as the men around him believed. I think he only allowed himself to admit that to paper, never aloud. Eleanor sat, drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders. He wrote the same to me, once, she said. Years ago, before any of this began, when our father died and he had to manage the estate alone at 19, with no notion of how. He told me later he had been terrified the entire time, and simply never let anyone see it. I think that was simply who he was. Frightened, and determined not to let the fright decide anything for him. That sounds like the same man who pulled me out of that position, Julian said quietly, frightened, and doing the brave thing regardless. They spent another hour there together, reading passages aloud to each other, laughing softly at the parts that revealed Henry's stubborn humor, falling quiet at the parts that revealed his fear. And by the time Eleanor finally rose to retire for the night, something had settled more firmly between them. A shared custody of grief that no longer felt like something either of them carried alone. It was only 2 days later that Edgar's letter arrived, shattering the fragile new peace they had only just begun to build, and reminding them both that grief was not the only inheritance Henry had left behind. There was also, it seemed, a family determined to profit from it. She was no longer entirely certain this marriage was only the bargain they had both called it on their wedding day, and that uncertainty, she realized as she watched Julian fold the letter with barely restrained anger, frightened her nearly as much as Edgar's threats did. The assembly room was already crowded when Julian and Eleanor arrived, candlelight glittering off silk and jewelry, the air thick with the low hum of 100 private conversations, at least a dozen of them Eleanor suspected, concerning her. "Smile," Julian murmured, his hand steady at the small of her back as they crossed the room. "Let them see there is nothing here to whisper about." "There is everything here to whisper about," Eleanor murmured back, keeping her own smile carefully in place. "That is rather the trouble." They had agreed, in the tense days since Edgar's letter arrived, that the surest way to blunt whatever rumors he intended to spread was to appear, publicly and often, as a couple entirely secure in each other. It had seemed, in Julian's study, like a reasonable strategy. Here, under the weight of so many watching eyes, with Julian's hand warm against her back and his shoulder brushing hers as they moved through the crowd, Eleanor found the strategy considerably harder to execute with any composure at all. The room itself seemed designed to make strangers feel exposed, tall mirrors lining one wall so that every entrance was doubled, every glance multiplied a dozen times over before it ever reached its intended target. Eleanor had attended assemblies before, in quieter years, but never one where she felt quite so thoroughly on display. Every stitch of her gown and every word from her mouth weighed and measured by an audience already primed to doubt her. Lady Ashcombe intercepted them almost immediately, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, delighted to have new material for the evening. "Your Grace," she said, "and Duchess, how well you both look. I confess I had heard the strangest rumor about a certain letter making the rounds of the district, something about the hastiness of your marriage." "Rumors," Julian said pleasantly, "are the last refuge of people with nothing interesting of their own to discuss. My wife and I find them tiresome." Lady Ashcombe's smile did not falter, but her eyes moved between them with obvious calculation. Of course. Though you must admit, so soon after Captain Calloway's death, some might find the timing curious." "Some might," Eleanor said, matching Julian's easy tone though her heart had begun to beat faster. "And some might also consider that a woman left alone with debts and a scheming cousin has very good reason to marry quickly, when the man offering marriage happens to be her late brother's dearest friend, keeping a promise made on a battlefield. I find that story considerably less curious than most." It was, Eleanor thought afterward, the first time she had spoken so plainly and so publicly about the truth of her situation, and something in Lady Ashcombe's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something almost like respect, before she moved off toward easier gossip elsewhere. "Well done," Julian murmured, close to her ear, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his breath against her skin, and had to look away to hide how it affected her. The evening wore on, and their performance, if it had ever truly been only a performance, began to feel less and less like one. Julian claimed her for the first dance, his hand firm at her waist, and Eleanor found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, at some dry observation he made about the dancing skills of a nearby colonel. When the dance ended, he did not release her hand as quickly as propriety strictly required, and she did not pull away as quickly as she might have. Later, when the crowded room grew too warm and the weight of so many curious eyes too heavy, Julian led her out onto the terrace, where the night air was cool and the noise of the assembly faded to a distant hum behind them. "You handled Lady Ashcombe better than I could have," he said, leaning against the stone balustrade, watching her rather than the garden below. I have had a great deal of practice defending myself, Eleanor said, though I confess it felt different tonight. Less like defending myself and more like defending us. Julian was quiet a moment. There is an us now, he said, half a question. Eleanor's heart climbed into her throat. I do not know what to call it, she admitted. It began as a bargain. I am no longer certain that is all it is. He turned to face her fully then, and the careful distance he had kept between them for so many months seemed to dissolve in the space of a single breath. It is not all it is. For me either, he said, his voice low. I have tried, these last weeks, to remember it should only be duty. I find I have stopped believing myself. The distance between them had narrowed without either of them quite deciding to close it, and Eleanor was aware, with a clarity that startled her, of exactly how close his face was to hers, of the way the moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, of how badly she wanted him to close that last small distance entirely. Julian's hand came up to touch her cheek, gentle, questioning, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved, caught between everything they had promised themselves this marriage would not become, and everything it clearly already was. Then Julian stepped back, sharp and sudden, as though he had touched something hot. I cannot, he said, his voice rough. Eleanor, I am sorry. I made a promise to Henry, not to myself. This, whatever this is between us, feels like a betrayal of that promise, as though I am taking something from him rather than honoring what he asked of me. The rejection landed harder than Eleanor expected. A cold shock after the warmth of a moment before. She stepped back as well, wrapping her composure around herself like a shawl against the sudden chill. Of course, she said, her voice carefully even. Forgive me. I forgot myself. You did nothing wrong, Julian said quickly, but the damage was already done. The moment already collapsed into something awkward and unfinished, and they returned to the assembly room in a silence that neither of them knew how to break. Inside the assembly room, the music had struck up again, and neither of them made any move to return to the noise and light. Eleanor stood at the balustrade a while longer, arms wrapped around herself against the cool night air, replaying the moment before Julian stepped back, trying to understand what exactly had frightened him so badly. She did not believe it was truly about Henry, not entirely. She suspected, though she could not yet prove it even to herself, that it was fear of an entirely different kind. The fear of wanting something so completely that losing it might undo him. When they finally returned inside, the assembly had shifted its attention elsewhere, some fresh scandal involving a visiting colonel's daughter drawing the room's gossip away from them for the remainder of the evening, and Eleanor was grateful for the reprieve even as the ache of Julian's withdrawal sat heavy and unresolved in her chest. They danced once more, out of necessity rather than desire, their steps correct and their conversation stilted, both of them aware of the other's nearness in a way that made the required distance between partners in a formal dance feel unbearably wide. The ride home was quiet, the carriage rattling over dark roads while Eleanor stared fixedly out the window, and Julian sat with his jaw tight, clearly wrestling with something he did not share. The wound of the evening had barely begun to close when Edgar Calloway's next move landed, 3 days later, in the form of a letter that spread through the district faster than either of them could contain it. Somehow, impossibly, a copy of a private letter Julian had written to his solicitor months earlier, discussing the arrangements of the marriage in blunt, practical terms. Arrangements he had made purely to protect Eleanor's inheritance from Edgar's claims, had been altered and circulated as proof that the Duke had always intended the marriage as a temporary convenience, to be quietly dissolved once Edgar's threat had passed. Eleanor read the forged letter with her hands shaking, not from grief this time but from a cold, clarifying fury. Every carefully protective word Julian had actually written had been twisted, small phrases removed, others added in a hand skilled enough to nearly pass for his own. He wants me to doubt you, Eleanor said, when she found Julian in the study, the false letter held out between them. He wants everyone in this district to believe you never meant any of this, so that when he moves against my inheritance again, no one will come to my defense. Julian took the letter, his expression darkening as he read it, and something in his face, some last careful restraint, finally gave way entirely. He has gone too far, he said quietly. This ends now. Eleanor watched him, and beneath the fear of what Edgar might do next, she felt something else stir, sharp and certain. Whatever had nearly happened on the terrace, whatever Julian had pulled himself back from in the name of a promise made to a dying man, it had not disappeared. It had only been driven underground, and Edgar's forged letter, meant to divide them, had instead handed them both a single shared purpose, fierce and undeniable. Julian spent the following morning composing a careful, public response, One he intended to send not only to his own solicitor but to Lady Ashcombe and several other prominent voices in the district, whose good opinion carried weight in exactly the circles Edgar hoped to poison. He laid out, in plain and measured language, the truth of the correspondence, explaining precisely how the letter had been altered, and inviting anyone who doubted the account to inspect the original in his solicitor's office themselves. "You cannot simply announce the truth and expect rumor to yield to it," Eleanor said, reading over his shoulder as he wrote. "Rumor moves faster than truth ever does. My cousin has always understood that better than most." "Then we will have to move faster still," Julian said. "I do not intend to let him dictate the terms of this fight any longer." Eleanor considered this a moment, then reached for a fresh sheet of paper of her own. "Let me write as well," she said. "A letter from me, in my own words, addressed to no one in particular, meant to be read aloud at the next assembly if it comes to that. Let people hear directly from the woman Edgar claims to be defending that she wants no part of his schemes and considers her marriage entirely her own choosing." Julian watched her write, quick and certain, no longer the careful, guarded hand she had used on their wedding day, and felt something settle firmly in his chest, a certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together rather than as two people merely sharing a house. The following week brought a small, unexpected victory. Mr. Pemberton, the district magistrate, called at Rowan Hall of his own accord, having heard enough conflicting rumors to grow curious himself. He examined both the forged letter and Julian's original correspondence, compared the handwriting with a magistrate's careful eye, and left with a promise to make quiet inquiries into where, precisely, Edgar Calloway had obtained access to private correspondence never meant for his eyes. "It will not silence him entirely," Julian warned, once Pemberton's carriage had disappeared down the drive, "but it will make him considerably more cautious about how far he is willing to push matters from here." Eleanor nodded, though the uneasy feeling that had settled over her since the forged letter first appeared did not entirely lift. "Edgar has never been cautious when he believes he is close to winning," she said. "If anything, this will only make him more reckless." She was, though neither of them yet knew it, entirely correct. They were no longer simply protecting a bargain. They were protecting each other, and neither of them, Eleanor suspected, was prepared to lose that fight. The note arrived before dawn, slipped under the front door of Rowan Hall by a hand no servant had seen, and Eleanor was the one who found it. Cold stone floor under her bare feet, the house still dark around her. "Come to the old mill by the river at noon, and come alone," Edgar had written. "Bring the deed papers your husband had drawn up last month, and sign what I ask, or every detail of your brother's death, twisted just enough to ruin the Duke's name in every drawing room in London, will be in print within the week. You know I am capable of it. Do not test me on this, cousin." Eleanor read it 3 times, her breath coming short in the cold morning air, and then she did something she would later admit to Julian was foolish, though at the time it had felt like the only choice available to her. She did not wake him. She did not send for Colonel Grant, or for the local magistrate, or for anyone at all. She dressed quickly, took the letter, and walked out into the gray morning alone, telling herself she would simply talk to Edgar, reason with him, find some way to end this without dragging Julian's name through any more scandal than it had already suffered. She had forgotten, in her haste, exactly how little reasoning had ever worked on her cousin. The old mill stood abandoned at the edge of the estate boundary, its wheel long since rotted still, the building itself a hollow shell of damp stone and broken beams. Edgar was waiting inside when she arrived, leaning against a crumbling wall with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "You came alone," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "I had rather hoped your husband would prove reckless enough to follow. It would have made this so much simpler." "I came to end this," Eleanor said, standing just inside the doorway, keeping the distance between them deliberate. "Whatever you think you know about Henry's death, whatever twisted version of it you intend to print, it will not work, Edgar. Julian's name is stronger than your lies." "Is it?" Edgar said, pushing off the wall and beginning to circle her slowly. "Because from where I stand, cousin, all it takes is one well-placed rumor, planted in the right ears, and a man's reputation crumbles far faster than you would like to believe. I do not even need it to be true. I only need enough people to wonder." The mill's broken roof let in thin bars of gray morning light, and somewhere above them a bird startled and beat its wings against the rafters before finding its way out through a gap in the stones. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on her cousin, refusing to let the sound draw her attention away even for a moment. She had learned long ago that Edgar fed on distraction, that any flicker of divided attention was an opening he would seize without hesitation. "You are a coward," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You could not win Henry's inheritance honestly, so you have spent a year trying to steal what is left of it through threats and forged letters. It ends today. I will not sign anything, and I will not be frightened into silence." Edgar's expression, pleasant and unhurried a moment before, hardened into something considerably colder. "Then you leave me no choice but to make this considerably harder on you than it needed to be," he said, and took a step closer, close enough that Eleanor's heart began to hammer with something sharper than anger now. It was at that exact moment that the mill door swung open behind her, and Julian's voice cut through the damp stone air, low and dangerous in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "Step away from my wife," Julian said. Edgar froze, his composure cracking for the first time. "How did you—" "Your rider was not as discreet as you believed," Julian said, crossing the room with a controlled fury that made even Edgar retreat a step. "And my wife is not nearly so easy to trap as you seem to think. Colonel Grant is outside with 2 men from the estate, along with the local magistrate, who has been rather curious about the forged letter you circulated through the district. I believe he would very much like to hear you explain, in detail, exactly how you came to alter my private correspondence." Edgar's eyes darted between them, calculation flickering rapidly behind his forced composure. "This is a family matter," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "There is no need to involve the magistrate." "There is every need," Julian said. "You have spent a year threatening my wife, forging documents, and spreading lies designed to destroy both our reputations for the sake of an inheritance that was never legally yours to claim. That is not a family matter, Edgar. That is a crime, and you are about to answer for it." Eleanor stepped forward then, no longer afraid, her voice ringing clear in the hollow stone room. "My brother died protecting a man he loved," she said. "He did not die so that you could spend the rest of your life picking over what little he left behind. I have carried his memory with more honor in the last year than you have shown in your entire life, Edgar, and I will not let you twist his death into another one of your schemes." Something in Edgar's face finally broke, the last of his confidence collapsing into something smaller and more desperate. And when Colonel Grant and the magistrate stepped through the doorway behind Julian, he did not resist, only stood there, pale and diminished, as the full weight of what he had done settled visibly over him. The magistrate, a stern man named Mr. Pemberton, spent the better part of an hour taking statements, examining the forged letter Eleanor had preserved, and questioning the rider who had delivered Edgar's early morning note, a stable boy from the village who admitted readily, once pressed, exactly who had paid him, and what he had been told to say. Colonel Grant, standing quietly near the doorway throughout the questioning, finally spoke up when Edgar attempted once more to characterize his actions as nothing more than a family disagreement blown out of proportion. "Forgive me for saying so plainly, sir," the colonel said, "but I have known this family for 30 years, and I have never once seen the Duchess behave with anything but honesty and fairness toward every soul on this estate, tenant and family alike. Whatever quarrel you believe you have with her, it does not extend to forged letters and threats delivered before dawn. That is not disagreement, that is a crime, plainly stated, and I for one am glad to see it answered for." Edgar had no response to that, and something in his posture seemed finally to accept, however grudgingly, that the fight had already been lost. By the time the sun had fully risen, Edgar Calloway had been taken into custody, his schemes laid bare in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to every drawing room in the district, though this time the story would be entirely true, and entirely in Eleanor and Julian's favor. It was only later, once the mill had emptied and the magistrate's carriage had disappeared down the lane, that Julian turned to Eleanor, his earlier fury giving way to something rawer, more exposed. "You should not have come here alone," he said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. "If anything had happened to you—" "I know," she said. "I was afraid, and foolish, and I did not want you dragged any further into Edgar's schemes than you already had been. I am sorry." Julian crossed the space between them, and took her face gently in both hands, and this time he did not step back. "I have spent a year telling myself that loving you would be some kind of betrayal," he said. "Standing in that doorway, seeing him near you, I understood how foolish that was. I do not love you because Henry asked me to look after you. I love you because you are brave, and stubborn, and entirely too quick to walk alone into danger, and because every single day since you arrived at Rowan Hall, you have made that house feel like a home for the first time since my mother died. Henry did not give me a duty when he made me promise to protect you, Eleanor. He gave me a gift, and I have been too afraid of my own guilt to open it properly until now." Eleanor's eyes filled, not with the old grief this time, but with something warmer, something that had been building quietly for weeks and finally found its way free. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for some time. I was only waiting for you to stop hiding behind Henry's memory long enough to say it first." Julian laughed, unsteady and relieved, and kissed her then, gentle and certain, in the ruined doorway of an old mill, with the morning light spilling in around them, and every shadow of Edgar's schemes finally, fully behind them. Back at Rowan Hall, the household greeted the news with open relief. Mrs. Whitfield wept openly in the front hall, insisting it was only the dust from the road that had gotten into her eyes, while Sophie ran to fetch tea and cakes without being asked, as though the entire house intended to celebrate before either Julian or Eleanor had said a word about celebration at all. Colonel Grant, arriving somewhat later than the rest, found Julian in the study and clasped his hand firmly. "I have served this family for 30 years, Your Grace," he said. "I do not mind telling you, this is the first time in all those years I have seen this house feel entirely at peace. Whatever it took to arrive here, I am glad it is behind you both." "It took a great deal more than either of us expected," Julian admitted, and Colonel Grant only nodded, understanding without needing further explanation, before excusing himself to see to the horses. That night, once the house had finally quieted, and the excitement of the day had settled into something calmer, Julian and Eleanor sat together in the small library, where they had once first spoken honestly of Henry, the very letters that had started so much of this still resting in their locked drawer nearby. "I keep thinking of something Henry wrote, near the end of his letters," Eleanor said, curled into the chair beside the fire, Julian's arm resting easily around her shoulders now, as though it had always belonged there. "He wrote that the people worth protecting were the ones who would go on protecting others in turn, long after he was gone. I did not understand it fully until today. I think he meant exactly this. Not just that you would look after me, but that we would learn, somehow, to look after each other, and that the protecting would not stop with either of us." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, unhurried and certain. "Then we have honored him exactly as he intended," he said. "Better perhaps than either of us believed possible on the day I first came to your door." Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire, the distant murmur of the household settling for the night, and felt, for the first time in what seemed like years, entirely and completely safe. They walked back to Rowan Hall together, hand in hand, and for the first time since her brother's death, Eleanor felt not the weight of grief carried alone, but the lightness of a promise finally, truly kept, not out of duty, but out of love freely given and freely returned. The trial date arrived faster than anyone expected, and Eleanor stood outside the county courthouse on a cold, bright morning, her hand tight around Julian's arm, watching a crowd gather that had come as much to witness the spectacle as to see justice done. Edgar Calloway was led and pale and thinner than she remembered, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through a year of threats and forged letters. He did not look at her as he passed, and Eleanor found she did not need him to. She had already said everything she needed to say to him, in the ruined doorway of the old mill, and she felt no urge to repeat it now for an audience. The proceedings were shorter than she expected. The forged letter, the stable boy's testimony, Mr. Pemberton's careful documentation of every thread of Edgar's scheme, left little room for doubt, and by early afternoon the matter was settled. Edgar would face transportation, his claim to any part of Henry's estate stripped entirely, his name disgraced in every circle that had once tolerated his company out of respect for a family he had spent a year trying to destroy. "It is over," Julian said quietly, as they left the courthouse together, the crowd parting around them with a mixture of curiosity and, for the first time in months, genuine warmth rather than suspicion. Eleanor let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the night of the assembly. "It is," she agreed, "and Henry's memory, whatever Edgar tried to make of it, is safe." They returned to Rowan Hall, to find the house transformed, not in any physical sense, but in the way a home changes once the shadow hanging over it finally lifts. Mrs. Whitfield had thrown open every window to let the spring air move freely through the halls. Sophie was singing softly to herself as she polished the front stair rail. Even the stern portrait of Julian's mother in the great hall seemed less forbidding than it once had, as though the house itself had exhaled. That evening, Julian led Eleanor not to the formal dining room but out to the garden, where a small table had been set beneath the old oak tree, candles glowing steady in the still evening air. "I did not marry you the way I should have," Julian said, once they were seated, once the first course had been cleared and the servants had withdrawn to give them privacy. "I married you out of guilt and grief and a promise made to a dying man, and though I do not regret keeping that promise, I regret that I let it stand between us for as long as it did." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "We do not have to regret the beginning," she said, "only to be grateful for where it has led us." Julian turned her hand over in his, tracing the lines of her palm with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Then let me ask you properly," he said, and rose from his chair to kneel beside her instead, drawing a small ring from his coat, plain gold, Nothing like the grand jewels she had half expected of a duke. Eleanor Ashworth, not Henry's sister, not a debt repaid, but yourself, entirely yourself. Will you stand beside me not because I promised your brother I would care for you, but because I choose you, freely, for exactly who you are? Will you renew these vows with me, in front of everyone who once doubted us, and let them see a marriage that began in grief become something neither of us expected, but both of us are grateful for? Eleanor's eyes filled, warm rather than sorrowful, and she laughed even as the tears fell. Yes, she said. Yes, entirely yes. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, enjoying the preparations in a way she had never expected to enjoy anything so tied to public display. She chose the flowers herself, simple white roses gathered from the estate's own gardens rather than anything ordered grandly from town, and she spent an afternoon with Mrs. Whitfield poring over old family recipes for the small wedding breakfast that would follow, insisting on dishes that had been favorites of her own mother, long before grief had scattered so much of that earlier happiness. Julian, for his part, surprised her one evening by producing a small, carefully wrapped parcel after dinner, containing a simple pendant, not costly, but clearly chosen with thought, a small oval locket engraved with their initials intertwined. I had a portrait of Henry copied small enough to fit inside, he explained, watching her open the clasp with careful fingers. I thought you might like to carry him with you, on a day meant to celebrate what his promise ultimately gave us both. Eleanor could not speak for a long moment, moved beyond words by the gesture, and when she finally did, her voice was thick with feeling she no longer tried to hide from him. It is perfect, she said. Thank you. The renewal of vows took place a month later, in the same small chapel where they had first married, though nothing else about the day resembled that quiet, guarded morning. The chapel was full this time, Lady Ashcombe seated in the second row with an expression of open approval, Colonel Grant beaming from the back, Sophie and half the household staff crowded near the door, having quietly insisted on attending. Eleanor wore white this time, not gray, and when she walked down the aisle toward Julian, she felt none of the careful composure that had carried her through their first wedding. She felt only certainty, warm and steady, growing with every step. Julian watched her come toward him with an expression he no longer bothered to guard, open and unmistakable, and when she reached him, he took both her hands in his and did not let go, not through the vows, not through the blessing, not through the quiet cheer that rose from the gathered crowd when the vicar finally pronounced them, once again, husband and wife. Afterward, standing together in the chapel doorway as the guests spilled out into the bright spring afternoon, Julian drew Eleanor close and rested his forehead against hers. Henry would have liked this day, he said quietly. Henry would have teased you mercilessly for taking so long to admit you loved me, Eleanor said, laughing. Julian laughed too, unguarded and easy in a way he had rarely allowed himself before Eleanor came into his life. That, he admitted, he certainly would have. They stood there a moment longer, watching the light move through the old chapel windows, and Eleanor thought of her brother, not with the sharp grief that had followed her for so long, but with something gentler, gratitude woven through the sorrow at last. He had asked Julian to protect her, expecting nothing more than duty fulfilled. Instead, he had given them both a chance at something neither had thought to hope for. A love built slowly, honestly, out of grief and honor, and the quiet courage it took two careful people to finally stop guarding their hearts. In the weeks after the renewal of their vows, Rowan Hall settled into a rhythm neither Julian nor Eleanor had known it capable of before. The formal portraits in the great hall remained, but they no longer seemed to loom quite so heavily over the rooms below. Eleanor had taken to hanging a small painting of her own beside them, a modest watercolor of the home farm Colonel Grant had commissioned in gratitude for her work with the ledgers, and somehow its plain, unpretentious presence softened the whole hallway, as though the house itself had finally been given permission to breathe. Lady Vane visited once more that summer, and though her sharp tongue had not entirely dulled, even she seemed to notice the change in the household. I confess, she said grudgingly over dinner, watching Julian reach across the table to refill Eleanor's glass without being asked, that I did not expect this marriage to become anything more than a convenient arrangement. I am pleased, however reluctantly, to admit I was wrong. You are welcome to admit it as reluctantly as you like, Julian said, smiling, so long as you admit it at all. Eleanor laughed at that, and even Lady Vane's stern mouth twitched toward something like a smile, before she caught herself and returned to her soup with great dignity. Colonel Grant, too, found new purpose in the changed household. With Eleanor's continued attention to the estate's accounts, the home farm flourished beyond even her earlier predictions, and by autumn, the Tennant family spoke of the Duchess with open warmth, grateful for a household finally run with fairness and sense rather than neglect. Sophie, the young housemaid who had once lingered hopefully near Eleanor's door, had been given a position of greater responsibility within the household, and took to it with a pride that reminded Eleanor, not unpleasantly, of her own early days at Rowan Hall, uncertain and eager to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her. One evening, walking together through the gardens as the last of the summer light faded gold over the hedgerows, Eleanor turned to Julian with a question that had been quietly forming in her mind for weeks. "Do you think Henry ever imagined this?" she asked. "Not simply that you would protect me, but that it would become something so entirely different from what either of us expected." Julian considered the question seriously, as he always did when Henry's memory arose between them. "I think," he said finally, "that Henry understood people better than either of us gave him credit for, even at the time. I think some part of him hoped for exactly this, even if he never allowed himself to say so plainly. He was not a man who spoke of hope easily. He preferred to act, and let the results speak for him." "Then he succeeded," Eleanor said softly, threading her arm through his as they continued down the garden path, "beyond anything he could have promised either of us on that battlefield." Julian pressed her hand where it rested against his arm, and they walked on together in comfortable silence, past the roses Eleanor had insisted on planting that spring, past the old oak tree where they had renewed their vows, toward a house that glowed warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk, no longer a place of grief carefully managed, but a true home, built slowly and honestly from the wreckage of loss into something neither of them had dared to hope for, and both had, in the end, found entirely worth the waiting. Rowan Hall, once a house of cold formality and disapproving portraits, had become, at last, a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and a love neither the Duke nor his Duchess had ever expected to find, but both would spend the rest of their lives grateful they had. A year had passed since the vows were renewed beneath the old oak tree, and Rowan Hall had changed again, this time with the sound of a child's laughter echoing through halls that had once known only silence and careful footsteps. Eleanor sat in the morning room with her son in her arms, barely 3 months old, his small fist curled tight around her finger, when Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway with an expression Eleanor had learned to read carefully over the past year. The particular stillness that meant trouble had arrived before anyone announced it properly. "There is a gentleman at the door, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said. "A Mr. Pratley. He says he has business regarding the Calloway estate that predates your marriage, and insists on speaking with the Duke directly." Eleanor felt an old, familiar tension return to her shoulders, though it was fainter now, dulled by a year of peace she had almost allowed herself to trust completely. She sent for Julian at once, and by the time he arrived, striding into the morning room still dressed for the stables, Mr. Pratley had already been shown into the front parlor, sitting stiffly on the edge of a chair with a leather case balanced on his knees. "Your Grace," Mr. Pratley said, rising quickly when Julian entered. "Duchess, I apologize for the intrusion. I would not have come, except that a matter has surfaced which I believe concerns you both directly." Julian's jaw tightened, old caution returning swiftly. "Speak plainly," he said. "This house has had enough of schemes disguised as courtesy calls." Mr. Pratley had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I understand your wariness, given my past association with your cousin," he said, nodding toward Eleanor. "I want to assure you both, I severed all connection with Edgar Calloway the moment his true character became clear to me. I did not come today on his behalf. I came because, in settling my own late father's affairs, I discovered a document that appears to belong to your family, Duchess. A letter, written by your father some years before his death, concerning a small parcel of land near the northern boundary of the Calloway estate that was never properly recorded in the entail." He opened the case and produced a folded paper, worn soft at the edges with age, and handed it to Eleanor with careful hands. Eleanor read it slowly, her breath catching as she recognized her father's familiar looping handwriting, describing a modest piece of land meant, in his own words, to pass directly to Eleanor upon her marriage, regardless of whatever became of the larger estate. It had simply been forgotten, misplaced among old papers, until now. "This changes nothing of consequence to your fortune," Mr. Pratley said quickly, seeing the surprise on both their faces. "It is a small parcel, worth little in itself, but I understand there is a modest stone cottage on the land, one your father apparently intended for you specifically. I thought you would want to know it exists, and that it is, by every right, entirely yours." After Mr. Pratley had gone, having declined refreshment and departed with visible relief at having discharged what he clearly considered an uncomfortable duty, Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap, tracing her father's handwriting with quiet wonder. "I did not know this existed," she said softly. Julian sat beside her, looking over her shoulder at the fragile old page. "Shall we go and see it?" he asked. "Whatever state it is in. It seems it was meant to be a gift from your father to you alone. I think that deserves to be honored properly." They rode out together 3 days later, leaving their son in Mrs. Whitfield's capable care, and found the cottage exactly where the letter described, tucked into a quiet hollow near the northern boundary, half overgrown with ivy but sound in its stone walls, sunlight pouring through windows that had not been opened in years. Eleanor stood in the small overgrown garden, imagining her father walking these same paths, choosing this quiet corner of the world to leave for her specifically, long before Edgar's schemes, long before the war took Henry, long before any of the grief that had shaped the last 2 years of her life. "He wanted me to have something that was entirely mine," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but something woven from both, somewhere no one could take from me, no matter what happened to the rest of the estate. Julian took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then let us make it exactly that," he said. "A place that belongs only to you, and to whoever you choose to share it with. We could restore it slowly, together, and bring our son here when he is old enough to understand why it matters." Eleanor smiled, looking around at the quiet hollow, the wildflowers growing thick between the old stones, the light falling soft and golden through the trees. "I would like that very much," she said. Over the following months, the cottage became a quiet project shared between them, visited on easy afternoons away from the busier demands of Rowan Hall, its garden slowly cleared and replanted, its stone walls patched and its windows reglazed until it stood, modest and warm, a small private corner of the world that belonged entirely to Eleanor and the family she had built. Word of Edgar's fate reached them occasionally, second-hand, softened by distance and time. He had been transported, his name struck from every register of polite society that had once tolerated him, and Eleanor found, when she thought of him at all, that the old anger had faded into something closer to distant pity, a man who had spent his one life scheming for what others had earned honestly, and lost everything in the attempt. Henry's memory, by contrast, only grew warmer with time. Eleanor kept his letters in a small carved box beside her bed, and on quiet evenings she would read them again, not with the old raw grief that had once accompanied every line, but with a gentle, grateful fondness, the kind reserved for a story that had, against every early expectation, found its way to a genuinely happy ending. On the first anniversary of their renewed vows, Julian and Eleanor stood together in the garden of the little stone cottage, their son asleep in a basket nearby, and watched the sun set slow and gold over the northern fields. "Do you ever think about that first day," Eleanor asked, "when you came to my door in London and I thought you nothing more than a man discharging a debt?" "Often," Julian admitted. "I think about how frightened I was, of failing Henry, of failing you, of feeling anything at all beyond duty when duty was the only thing I trusted myself to manage properly." "And now?" Eleanor asked, smiling. "Now," Julian said, drawing her close as the last light faded gently over the fields, "I think Henry knew exactly what he was doing when he asked me to look after you. I think he knew, better than either of us did at the time, precisely what we would become to each other, given enough patience, enough honesty, and enough courage to stop hiding behind grief and guilt long enough to see what was standing right in front of us." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching their son sleep peacefully beside them, the cottage her father had left her standing warm and solid at their backs, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, no trace of the fear or grief that had once defined nearly every corner of her life. In the years that followed, the cottage became something of a family tradition, a place they returned to each spring when the wildflowers bloomed thick through the hollow, and where, in time, their son was joined by a daughter with her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Eleanor taught both children to read from Henry's old letters, softened and simplified into stories fit for young ears, tales of a brave uncle they would never meet, but would grow up knowing all the same, a man whose courage had, in ways neither child could fully understand until they were older, shaped the entire foundation of the family they were born into. Julian, for his part, never stopped marveling at how thoroughly his life had changed from that cold October afternoon, when he had stood outside a narrow London townhouse, rehearsing words of duty and obligation, certain he understood exactly what this marriage would require of him. He had expected debt repaid, honor satisfied, a promise kept and then quietly set aside. He had not expected a partner who would challenge him, steady him, and teach him that love, real love, was not a betrayal of grief, but its truest, most lasting expression. On evenings when the household had settled and the children were finally asleep, Julian and Eleanor often found their way back to the small library where so much of their story had first unfolded honestly between them. Henry's letters still resting in their carved box nearby, no longer locked away out of guilt, but kept close out of love. They would sit together by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply content in each other's company. And Eleanor would think, every time, of how far they had traveled from that first careful, guarded carriage ride toward Rowan Hall, two strangers bound by grief and duty, who had somehow, against every early expectation, found their way to something neither of them had dared imagine possible. Henry had asked for a promise, and Julian had kept it faithfully, in every way that mattered. But the greatest gift, Eleanor often thought, watching her husband across the quiet room, their children's laughter still echoing faintly somewhere upstairs, was not the promise itself, but everything neither of them had known to hope for when it was first made. A love built patiently out of honesty, courage, and the quiet, steady choice to keep choosing each other, every single day that followed. There was only this, quiet and certain and entirely hers. A family built from loss but sustained, in the end, by a love neither of them had expected, but both had chosen, again and again, freely and completely, until it became the truest thing either of them had ever known.